So the next presenter is Dan McQueen. We have done a number of substances, and he's going to talk about a substance that all of us are probably most familiar with, dope. And it's really intriguing that he's actually, most of us who indulge in a substance from time to time, don't explore its therapeutic potential. And he's actually working on that in, of all places, Denver, Colorado, of course. And so I'm really looking forward to hear what Dan has to say about his therapy program utilizing marijuana. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doctor. I really appreciate the invitation to be out here. It's a real honor to be in Boston. Let's just also acknowledge the teams that are working out here and the other presenters. So thank you very much for having me. Also like to acknowledge the hardship of that the many people and researchers have had to face in doing this work, and I'm part of that lineage. Also want to name that acknowledge women of the movement, people of color and minority communities and queer communities. There's a Queering Psychedelics conference happening today and tomorrow in San Francisco, so it's a big part of our movement as well. And I want to also acknowledge that within this healing context, we're in a climate crisis, and so I'm speaking from that perspective. My name is Daniel McQueen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Medicinal Mindfulness in Boulder, Colorado. I've been working with cannabis as a psychedelic since it became legal in Colorado about 5 years ago, in 2014. So I'd like to ask, who here wants to be a psychedelic therapist? A few of you. What if I were to tell you that you could do this work? You could do the work like Dr. Mithoefer's doing and the Psilocybin teams are doing. You can do this legally, and you can do this in this city, in Boston. But all you had to do is work with cannabis sativa instead of MDMA or psilocybin. Now, who here believes that might be possible? This is a new idea. So a couple of years ago, there'd be maybe one hand raising in this. So it's a very new idea of cannabis-assisted psychedelic therapy. But a lot of people have a visceral response to working with cannabis as well. There's like a reaction to it. And I would suggest that might be more of a trauma response to prohibition and the war on drugs than maybe any sort of objective fact. There's also just this general disbelief, right, that we can't do this work with cannabis. Now, I'm not going to go into it too much right now, but all I can say is cannabis isn't the same substance it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, particularly in the psychedelic 60s. So I've been working as a psychedelic therapist full-time for the last 5 years, legally. I like this TV screen over here. It's pretty cool. We just started the Medicinal Mindfulness Center for Psychedelic Therapy. My wife is the clinical director. She's MAPS-trained MDMA therapist. We have a psychedelic training program. Everybody who's been speaking about the psychedelic training programs, and we have one too with cannabis-assisted psychedelic therapy. And I also do groups called Conscious Cannabis Circles. And we have groups in Boulder now. We have groups in LA, San Francisco, Canada. One's forming in Alaska, and I'm also getting to facilitate my first group here in Boston tomorrow night. So this is a real thing, even though nobody knows about it. We're also starting a religious nonprofit, so I work with a lot of people who want to be psychedelic therapists who aren't psychotherapists. So we're working within a religious context as well and exploring what that means. And that in that context is more of a guided mindfulness practice. And then I have something called Extended State DMT Research Program, which I won't talk about today. But cannabis or medicinal mindfulness is also a signatory in the Open Sciences, which all the other researchers have signed up on. But what that means is, as a practitioner, is we share all our documentation, all our forms, and I give presentations on how to do this work, even though there's nothing published yet. So I'm going to speak to cannabis, the current cannabis research, something called cannabis-assisted psychedelic therapy, and then speak to a case study. My primary intention is to inspire more research, and then speaking of the psychedelic frontier, which Bill, you spoke to, it's like I'm speaking from that space, and we had to explore this work before we could start researching it. So that's kind of where we are. So I'd like to any researchers, psychiatrists who are interested in cannabis research, please come talk with me, and I'd love to work with you. So just to give you a little bit of a basic information is that we all have something called an endocannabinoid system in our bodies. And the primary purpose of the endocannabinoid system is to bring us back to homeostasis when we're, either too elevated or hypo-aroused, right? And that this is really connects with the window of tolerance thing that Dr. Mithoefer was speaking about too, and that if you're overactivated, if you use cannabis skillfully, it can bring you back into your window of tolerance. If you're under-aroused, it can bring you back into your window of tolerance. And that there's these endocannabinoids that you may have heard of, and that cannabis, sativa, THC, CBD, other cannabinoids fit into these receptors. So this is something in all of our cells. It's not just neurological, it's actually in our physical, like our guts and also in our muscles and tissues. And that anytime we're out of balance, the endocannabinoid system activates these endocannabinoids to bring balance back to the system. So there's a few primary cannabinoids that we're speaking to today. THC, which is the thing that gets you high. CBD is like an antidote to THC. It's used for epilepsy and other things. CBG is not well known, but it's also another cannabinoid that can help reduce the paranoia associated with cannabis. And then CBN, which I would consider to be the next big thing, cannabinoid, is used as a sleep aid, but it's also a deep tissue muscle relaxation. On top of that, we have these other chemicals in cannabis that affect the high, the psychedelic nature of the experience. These are called terpenes, and this is what makes the cannabis smell different ways, and also impact mental states. And so these themselves have therapeutic uses. So pinene, for instance, smells like pine needles. Rosemary is for inflammation. Myrcene is like a body relaxing medicine. Limonene is an activating medicine. Think of like when you smell lemons, you get more awake. Beta-caryophyllene is in black pepper and cloves. It's another muscle relaxation and tool, and also stress reducer. Linalool is in lavender. So if you think of lavender as sedating, right, and relaxing. And humulene is in hops, and it's for inflammation and pain. So these medicines, including the cannabinoids, don't just affect mental states, but they also affect our physical bodies. And we've talked to, somatic psychotherapy. Trauma is stored in the body, so this is an important part of the healing practice. So there's a hidden gestalt in psychedelic cannabis therapy. And this is called the entourage effect. Cannabis psychotherapy doesn't quite fit into a reductionist point of view where it's just one medicine, one treatment, one modality, and that's it, right? And it's way more complicated than that. And for those of you who are interested in studying cannabinoids, there's 113 of them, and there's over 200 terpenes, and the combinations affect the mental states differently. This is Colorado cannabis grow facility. And, so Colorado's an interesting place. We just voted to decriminalize psilocybin in Denver, right? So we're right on these edges of these medicines are already being used out of the clinical setting, and they're being used for clinical purposes, right? And so the thing to note here is that again, cannabis doesn't fit in these research boxes because how it's grown, where it's grown, nutrients used, when it is harvested, all affect the terpene and cannabinoid profiles, and all of those affect the different mind states. And we're actually creating an AI program, an algorithm, to put all this info in there so that we can start to understand the effects, right? And it's fun watching the other presenters. I started adding slides to speak to some of the things that were coming up. So the idea that psilocybin and MDMA are like jewels, right? I like to play with alchemy analogies. Psilocybin and MDMA are like the gold and silver of the psychedelic movement. If that's the case, then cannabis is the copper. It's still a precious metal, but it's more useful. And I don't know if you noticed, but we're surrounded by copper right now. It's all in the walls. It's what gets my computer working, so it's incredibly useful. And just like that, we're surrounded by cannabis. It's legal here. It's legal. 65% of the U.S. population can use it now legally, right? We also combine set and setting with a third dimension called skill. And the idea that psilocybin or MDMA can induce particular mind states that mimic mindfulness practices. And that when those skill sets are combined with cannabis, we can mimic the effects of psilocybin and MDMA with cannabis. Just pretty amazing in my opinion. So as we get going, I want to speak to a little bit about the research. This first was a study that's just like, what are people using medical cannabis for, right? And so it's for symptom management primarily. Third are using it for mood disorders, depression, anxiety, and trauma. Third are using it for pain relief. And then about 15% are using it for sleep disorders. In my opinion, all of these are trauma related. And people are smart. They wouldn't be using this medicine if it weren't helping them in some way. There's this new term in the research called cannabis for therapeutic purposes. And so mental health is the primary reason people are using cannabis. It has the potential to treat PTSD and trauma. And the nice thing about it is that it's not, it also has potential to treat substance use disorders. So even though it's a drug and it's called the gateway drug, it's really not a gateway to abuse. It's actually helping people get off of other drugs, opiates, things like that. And what we found is working with people with cannabis who are regular users, that if we just bring intention to their cannabis use, they start to automatically start reducing their use. We don't have to have huge conversations around that. Cannabis may influence cognitive abilities, particularly short-term memory. I can attest to that. And it doesn't increase the risk of harm to self or others. And I think this is important to note, so that especially in cannabis-assisted psychotherapy, that after a session, people don't crash, sometimes like they do after an MDMA session, and they don't become suicidal. They actually sleep better and feel better. And I haven't experienced any of that. And then more research is needed, obviously, right? So let's speak to one of the most important research studies that's happening now. This is Dr. Sue Sisley. This is one of our pioneers in cannabis research, and she's doing a study to determine if cannabis can be used for the treatment of PTSD. And we already know that it can, but this is to prove it. So MAPS sponsored studies, and she had lost her job at the University of Arizona, and then Colorado gave her a multi-million-dollar grant to do this study. It hasn't been completed yet, but they've completed all of the tests. The subjects have gone through the protocol, but we don't know the results yet. I would be really surprised though if it didn't show significant improvement in the symptoms. And here's the dosage that she's using, what they're calling a high THC dose, high CBD dose, a THC and CBD combination, and then a placebo. And just to give you an idea, it's like we talk about like cannabis as a symptom manager. To self-medicate at these levels, it's 250 milligrams of THC level. It's $300 to $500 a month. They're up to $6,000 a year. So it's not that affordable if you think about it at these levels. And then it's also 1.8 grams of cannabis every day, which is a pretty significant amount. I think it's up to 1.8. I think they have some variable there. And so I got some cannabis out of a little jar and weighed it to show you what that looked like. This is good quality cannabis. This cannabis right here is from a local dispensary in Boulder. It's twice as high in the THC content, so you'd have to smoke half as much. For example, no CBD. This is an indica dominant hybrid called Cosmic Railway. There's all kinds of great names for cannabis. And then this is the cannabis that she was allowed to use. This is Mississippi grown government cannabis. I've never seen anything like this. And so like disregard the terpene profiles completely. There's no useful terpenes in this. I asked my daughter, who's 5 years old, what she thought it looked like, and she said pine needles. And asked my dad if this looked like this is what pot looked like in Vietnam, and he said, yeah, that's pretty much what it looked like in Vietnam. But I don't know if I could even smoke that. I mean, I really I've never seen anything like it. It's just like stems. So this is the cannabis, and then this is what it's supposed to look like. This is what we have access to. So organically grown, no pesticides, no mold, nothing in there that's going to affect the body in a negative way. You can vape it instead of smoke it to reduce the impact on your lungs. You can also drink it, eat it, put it on a patch. There's 1,000 different ways to use this medicine now. Because it's legal, we have access to all of these medicines. We can, and honestly, I wouldn't have a program working with cannabis as a psychedelic if it weren't for access to this really high potency cannabis. We're talking 25, 30% THC with really wonderful terpene profiles. I get these whole sheets of terpene profiles, and I can't understand any of it because it's so complicated. So again, that's why we're going into starting to talk about AI. So another big question I'd like to acknowledge is that there's a question of, is it symptom management or is it actually a healing? Does it have healing properties? Can we use it to heal trauma? And that there's a new Canadian study that's just been proposed to explore cannabis for the treatment of arthritis, because what they found is that these CB1 receptors are like the joints in our body that have arthritis and are inflamed are actually full of these CB1 receptors. And so it might be pointing to mechanisms of real healing happening. And I don't know if it's the case for all people with severe trauma, but it's not just a psychological disorder. There's actually physical injuries. If you think of PTSD caused by a car accident or something like that, there are actual physical injuries that are happening. And can cannabis be used to alleviate the pain of those injuries, not just suppress it, but to address it? And I've actually experienced, so speaking of arthritis, I actually experienced a spontaneous healing episode. Somebody I didn't know he had arthritis. In the session, he started to shake, and his right arm started to shake out really big, and I had to support it, make sure he didn't hurt himself. And it shook out and straightened out. And he said afterwards that he has rheumatoid arthritis, and that he wasn't able to straighten his arm for years. And over a period of several sessions, he did this shaking thing, and now he has full mobility, and his rheumatoid arthritis is in remission. And so these practices, in conjunction with medicine, can actually heal physical trauma as well as psychological injury, which to me is pretty amazing. It's also anti-inflammation. So if you think of trauma as causing autoimmune injuries and things like that, is that these medicines are anti-inflammatory as well. So it's addressing the tissue, and that as the tissue relaxes, then the trauma can be discharged and released. So we're developing something that we're calling cannabis-assisted psychedelic therapy. The reason we put psychedelic therapy in there is because most people don't associate cannabis with psychedelics, right? And so we're not just calling it cannabis-assisted psychotherapy, which is also a very legitimate term. I like to think of the psychotherapy as a subset, because it's it can also be psycholytic and also more like MDMA in that way. And then here's a new slide that I just added because everybody was talking about the treatment protocols. My wife is a trained MDMA therapist, Allison, and she uses the MAPS MDMA treatment protocol, multiple sessions for prep, cannabis session, and then integration prep, cannabis session, same as that protocol. Long-term, ongoing practice. Cannabis is also very safe to use on a weekly basis for psychotherapy, so there's not these neurological effects as with MDMA, or it's not too intense like psilocybin is. So it can be used as an ongoing weekly practice, and I have multiple clients who work with me in that way. And the integration and prep actually happens in the session, and then we do a cannabis session within another week, or if they need to take a break, we'll do integration sessions, and then we'll step back into the cannabis work. And then another way that a lot of my clients work is it's real short term psychotherapy. Do an intake phone call and prep session. People fly in for a 2 day session. It's 5 hours each day, and then they fly out the next day, do an integration call, and then as needed. Usually they have a therapist already, or they're working with somebody that they can do the ongoing therapeutic support. And then and some people come back annually for that, and other people are like one session, one series, and they feel good enough to be complete with the therapy. So the term cannabis assisted is it's super new. It's only within the last year or so it's starting to be spoken to. These are the two primary books in the psychedelic community that people have written about cannabis. Neither cannabis assisted is not in either of these books. Cannabis assisted anything. And then the term psychedelic isn't well established in relationship to psychedelics or to cannabis either. And so, and I'd like to just point out this book right here. This was written by Joan Bello. She has a 50-year relationship with the medicine. And she's outside of the research and psychiatry fields as well. But this is, if anybody's interested in learning, doing some research, she's got a lot of incredible ideas in this. And so I'd like to read a little bit now about cannabis-assisted psychotherapy. So even though cannabis has been used as a symptom manager and is studied for this, does this actually prove that symptom management is limited of its potential? Because all psychedelics can be taken at lower doses to mimic alcohol and opiates. They can also be taken at what's called microdoses to alleviate symptoms, right? It's just like Prozac would be. If you took a whole bunch of Prozac, it'd probably be affecting you a lot more than it does at these doses, right? And so microdosing psilocybin is a brand new thing. LSD, these are things that people are gaining incredible relief from, and I've seen the power of psilocybin as a microdose work with a lot of my clients who have neurological disorders. And so, but most people who use cannabis as a psychedelic, they accidentally do it. They hallucinate. It's usually like an edible or something, right? They took too many of an edible, and they get sick. They have panic attacks. Sometimes they call 911 because they think they're dying. They vomit all over the place, you know. So cannabis as a psychedelic has a really bad rep. But what if cannabis can be formulated in such a way to reduce all of those negative side effects and keep all the positive ones? And that's what we've been experimenting with. And if so, can these intervisual experiences, these mystical type experiences, can they be used? Are they as useful with psychedelic cannabis as they are with, say, psilocybin or LSD and that sort of thing? Can we also formulate cannabis in a way to specifically address trauma and other mental health disorders? And so I'd like to read a little bit from Joan Bello, because she speaks to it way better than I could. The wonder of cannabis is that it works in the body as an antidote to extreme swings. It does not only stimulate, it does not only depress, it does both at the same time. The simultaneous opposing actions of cannabis is akin to balancing our nervous system and can be understood as a charged equilibrium. So imagine you're elevated, you're amplified, awake, and you're also deeply relaxed at the same time. That's a charged equilibrium. It slows our breathing, but it also increases our oxygen intake. So it's activating the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system at the same time. And at the same time this is doing, it's not just an emotional or psychological or mental state, it's impacting all of the muscles, all of the tendons, all our joints, and reducing physical tension and inflammation. In cannabis, we're either relaxed or stimulated, and cannabis does both. It appears that by impacting the autonomic nervous system at its point of origin, above its locale of bifurcation in the body, cannabis resolves the relaxation response and the fight or flight reaction into one, thereby producing the subjective experience of unity, wholeness, oneness, the paradox of the resolution of opposites. So in this state, it's very similar to MDMA. It activates the trauma and the memories and everything, but then it keeps your body relaxed so you're not running out of the room. And so this is where we were at with cannabis. And when cannabis became legal in Colorado, we were able to take it further. And so from here, what we add what we know about the entourage effect of different cannabinoids and terpenes. And THC is like the rocket booster. It gets us to the psychedelic state. The CBD relaxes the body. And then CBN, which again I think is going to be the next big thing, deeply relaxes the body. And it also is an antidote to the anxiety that's provoked by the THC. So you can take more of the THC without it negatively affecting you. Again, reducing the potential of panic and anxiety and paranoia, all of which are associated with this medicine. Even as clients go into deep psychedelic states, something is specifically being addressed with the muscles. And we call psychedelic cannabis for this reason the somatic psychedelic. For people with trauma, this relaxation often causes significant trembling, shaking, pulsing, and spasms throughout the body. And this is happening in the sessions. And very similar to MDMA in that regard. And it can last for many hours. And this phenomenon often occurs just at the beginning of the treatment protocol. So as somebody is starting to release and resolve their trauma, they're able to, they stop shaking so much in the sessions. And a lot of people describe it as shivering. They say they're cold, but they're not, like they're not really cold, but like they say, I'm not really cold, but I'm shivering like I'm cold. That's that discharge, the somatic discharge releasing. The primary difference between psychedelic cannabis and psilocybin, for example, is that people are able to retain their agency, which is one of the primary differences. And to me, that's really important to speak as a psychedelic facilitator who's trauma-informed, because oftentimes our loss of agency in a traumatic experience is a major factor in the trauma. So healing on your terms, at a pace that works for you, being able to choose to go deeper or not, and even take a break from the experience, is part of the corrective experience of healing trauma. And so imagine a 3-hour DMT level psychedelic experience with the emotional support of MDMA and the capacity to retain your sense of agency. And this is what we're experiencing with psychedelic cannabis. But unfortunately, it just doesn't fit in a reductionist, single variable model. So it's not being explored in that way. And so this is just showing different strains being mixed together. This is CBN strain at the top. And this is how we make the medicine. Use a mortar and pestle. Grind it really good so that there's so that the terpene profiles and cannabinoids are mixed well. And then we offer it in a nice pipe or a vaporizer for those who've never smoked before. This is what it looks like. So cannabis-assisted psychedelic therapy can be described as a synergistic fusion of multiple strains of cannabis within a therapeutic container, setting, and skill. And it acts as MDMA and psilocybin. So it mimics. So remember, it gives you what you need. So if you're elevated, it relaxes you. If you're deflated, it builds you up, right? And so that's the endocannabinoid system working. And so in that space, it can look like MDMA one day, and the same strain can look like psilocybin the next day. It's really unusual. It doesn't require extremely high doses. We're talking as somebody who's not naive to cannabis. For instance, the case study I'm going to be speaking to, he took a few puffs, not much cannabis at all. Whereas other people require more, who are regular users, but it can still work for both types of people. And it's with agency, and the peak of the experience is reached within minutes, because it's inhaled, and it can be programmed to go to different intensities and also be programmed to go for different lengths of time. So like my preferred session is 5 hours long with a 3 to 3.5 hour cannabis experience. But they can also be put in a 3 hours, a full-blown psychedelic cannabis experience can be put in a 3-hour experience. You can also do 2 to 3 hour cannabis-assisted psychotherapy or psycholytic experiences with this medicine. And they're all trauma healing. Just like to point out, so it's the second psychedelic that's now legal to use behind ketamine assisted psychotherapy. Can be used ongoing for therapeutic practices and psychedelic exploration. And this is the most controversial question, but I've seen this in action, so I'm stating it here. Maybe as effective as other psychedelic medicines for treating significant clinical disorders if placed in the appropriate protocol. And so, what if it's as effective as MDMA in treating PTSD? It just looks different, right? We've seen incredible results with this medicine. And so, somebody mentioned the betterment of well people. Cannabis can be used as a psychedelic, like as an ongoing practice for treatment of, for just general betterment, right, and exploration. It's an incredible problem-solving tool. Everybody talks about the creative potential of cannabis, right? And it can be used for trauma resolution, nervous system regulation. Another thing it can be used for is what we call resilience development, which reduces the likelihood of somebody being traumatized in the first place. So you're learning these skill sets, you're tempering your nervous system by going through these experiences, and you're more resilient facing traumatic events. And this is important to healers like us, and also activists and people who want to transform the world, right? You got to be resilient to challenge oppressive systems. Another thing we've noticed about psychedelic cannabis is that it's a good integration tool. So people come see me for psychedelic cannabis experience after ayahuasca journeys and such. So it's a way to tap back into these experiences without the full commitment of an all-night ceremony, that sort of thing. And then the mindfulness skill development. It's an amplifier of mindfulness practices when used appropriately. Another great thing about this medicine, we've been speaking to mostly individual psychotherapy today. This can be used safely in small groups, large groups, and even large groups with significant trauma. So there's something about containment and support that's embedded in it. And it's not as doesn't require as much of the containment as, say, like a group MDMA session. We don't, there's no devolving into cuddle puddles or anything like that. And so when we blend the strains, so sativas are really great mental amplifying medicines, but they provoke incredible amount of anxiety. The hybrids, or the indicas on the other side, are incredible body medicines, but they evoke deep sleep, dullness in the mind, and that sort of thing, right? And then the hybrids are in between. These are the strain families that are in between what are called indicas and sativas, and they're more heart-opening medicines. And when we combine these three different strain families together, the negative traits cancel out, and you keep the positive traits. So the sleepy, deep relaxation of the indica takes away the anxiety and paranoia of the sativa, and the sativa, the energy of the sativa, takes the sleepiness away. So what you're left with is a hyper-amplified mental state with a deeply relaxed body. This allows the discharge to take place, the deep relaxation in the body. It's really one of the most amazing things I've experienced. The hybrids evoke the self-compassion, the heart opening, increased empathy, increased emotional awareness, similar to MDMA. So I'm not going to speak too much of this, but THC is like the booster rocket. The terpenes are like the navigational tools. They take us to a particular mind state. The CBD is an adjunct. So CBD, when used with THC, can block THC in the receptors. But if you take it after THC, you keep the high, but it reduces your physical stress and tension in the body. It's also used as an antidote. So this is a product that we have available to us. This is called nano encapsulated CBD. It's water soluble, so it absorbs right into your system from your mouth, and it can reduce panic attacks and stress, anxiety, paranoia if you take too much THC within a matter of a minute or two. And it can also possibly be used with other psychedelic medicines. So like if there was a crisis with psilocybin or LSD or something at a festival or something, you just give somebody a couple of squirts and it'll calm them right down. But it'll keep them in that elevated state. So we have a natural antidote in the medicine itself, and nobody can say, oh, you're experiencing a really bad trip on mushrooms, you should take more mushrooms or take more LSD. But we actually have a medicine that's embedded in the plant itself that is a natural antidote to THC. And then again, CBN is a deep tissue relaxing agent. And it also it takes away the negative traits of the THC. So I think CBN is going to be the next thing. It's also extremely psychedelic. It just usually puts people to sleep before they experience a psychedelic state. And so when you combine it with THC, the energetic, super strong sativa, the THC, you stay awake, and it adds a rich, like a dimension, like it has a little more depth. Your psychedelic experience has a little more depth. So we mentioned the chakra systems, that like psilocybin is upper chakras, MDMA is heart, and then cannabis is body, right? And so not just the body though, but we can elevate the heart and we can elevate the mind with cannabis. So it's a full body experience. Another difficulty bringing cannabis into a research space is that the dosing is completely subjective. I work with some people who've never smoked before, and they take a few puffs, which could be the equivalent of 10 to 20 milligrams of THC. Other people have the exact same experience, but they take 10 to 20 times that amount. And so like a bowl or 2 bowls. We're still talking about low doses, relatively speaking, but there's a huge range. And so all doses are therapeutic, though. And so in regards to the agency that people who use psychedelic cannabis experience, I give my clients the choice of how much they take. And I kind of know at this point, working with so many people, that it's really safe for you to go deeper if you would like, and invite them to go deeper, but it's not required. Here's some different ways a psychedelic cannabis experience can go. So the top one is kind of where I like to work. This is a 5-hour experience with a 3-hour journey. Very psychedelic, akin to MDMA or psilocybin. But there can be a break in the middle, or they can go to a bathroom. They can even take a break from the experience of the medicine, and then they smoke again and go into it again. This is great for my schedule because I take my kids to school at 9. I get my room ready by 10. I have a 5-hour session at 3, pick up my girls at 3:30, and I'm off for the day. So it's like a really nice fit for working parent. It can also be like more psychotherapeutic or psycholytic, and it can fit into shorter sessions, and it doesn't have to be as intense for it to be effective trauma resolution modality. So at the bottom you see this line between psycholytic and psychedelic, and that we can actually work within the psycholytic area within a 2-hour frame or a 3-hour frame for the sessions. So I believe a research protocol can be developed using cannabis-assisted psychedelic therapy, psychedelic cannabis mindfulness techniques, breath work, and cannabis-assisted breath work. We do that too, within a therapeutic container for PTSD. And we can do this in group settings and on a large scale. It wouldn't quite fit into the research protocol of, again, the reductionist thing because of the multiple variables and the flexibility that's required. But if you were going to think of studying one thing, as a variable, I would say study the entourage effect. And this wouldn't work with that Mississippi-grown pot. I don't think it would. It wouldn't work as effectively, and so there's that problem too. So right now, it's outside of the research realm. Another way cannabis can be used is in conjunction with MDMA therapy. So, we're living in Boulder, and which is the site of a phase 2 MDMA map study. And after people go through the protocol and the year of all of that, sometimes they come back for more therapy. And cannabis is a way to treat the trauma of people that don't qualify for a full PTSD diagnosis, but are still significantly struggling with trauma. It can also be used in a personal healing practice. We can teach people how to do this work on their own without having a therapist in the room. We've done one EEG case study, and the brain map is the same with psychedelic cannabis as it is with other psychedelics. The research, the data is very limited though, but it's showing that it's similar. It turns the default mode network off like other psychedelics do. And when used in this way, it does the opposite of what cannabis is supposed to do. So there's a lot of studies on what cannabis does in EEGs, like research or recreational settings with cannabis. It does the opposite in this setting. We did another case study where we compared we did altered states of consciousness survey, which is the OAV, and there's a lot of research on this, and it's been used in a lot of studies to show what psychedelics do to the mind, through subjectively speaking, and it breaks it up into these different categories. And as you can see, they kind of all top off at the 50% mark of theoretical scale maximums. This is typical. This was like a large study comparing a lot of different studies, psilocybin, ketamine, and MDMA. So we did this study. There's no control group. 32 of 52 people did the survey after a conscious cannabis circle. This is in San Francisco. So it's got some things that we would need to actually address. Here's the same data on psilocybin, MDMA, and ketamine. And this is the data on psychedelic cannabis. You can see it's over twice as much compared to the others, minus the impaired cognition and anxieties. And so I double, triple, quadruple check the data. This is the results of it, but clearly we need to do further study to explore how it really does compare. I have been looking for DMT and ayahuasca levels to see how it compares to that, and I would suspect that it might be closer to that. It's just pretty far out. This is my office, one of my offices. This is where I work. Here's another picture of that. This is when we're doing the Gaia TV production. This is my wife's office. You can see it's very similar to the other psychedelic therapy. Here's a group space. And then here's a 30-person psychedelic therapy or cannabis experience with live music. This is the yoga center we work out of. So as you see, it's a real thing. We actually are doing this. And here's some more. So you see people in the circle, it's like they're well contained. They stay on their mats. They stay in their inner experience. They might be shaking or trembling or that sort of thing, but it's very well contained. Really deeply meaningful experiences. Most people describe them as like short ayahuasca journeys. And then our psychedelic therapy training program, I've trained a couple hundred people in this modality so far, in different degrees. The average age of our last group was 43. And then we don't have a limit. We don't just let counselors or psychotherapists come in. We have ministers, yoga people, massage therapists. A lot of entrepreneurs are into this work. Here's a couple of my students conducting a session in the class. So here's the smoking ceremony. Here's my student holding space for another one. And then here they are talking about it afterwards. Here's a group imbibing ceremony. So we smoke the medicine with intention. And then here are people laying down after that. This is a cannabis-assisted breathwork session in a group setting. And this is a group setting again. I recently worked with a young Jewish man with significant depression, anxiety, with panic attacks, insomnia, who self-reported significant childhood neglect and abuse, and he had severe intergenerational trauma, primarily Holocaust and World War II ancestral trauma. Self-reported as having chronic treatment-resistant PTSD. He had read every single book on somatic psychotherapies, including Body Keeps a Score. He had never smoked cannabis or used any drugs before, and he sought my services because he's looking for a somatic informed facilitator of psychedelic cannabis or psychedelic experience. The protocol included email correspondence, intake, and assessment with 2 5-hour psychedelic cannabis sessions over 2 days with a follow-up email and phone conversations. And he gave me permission to record the session and to use not the recording, but to discuss his session with you all. The first psychedelic cannabis session could most accurately be described as very MDMA-like, with lots of pulsations through the body and shaking, particularly in the hips and hands. He was only able to take a few inhalations, so we're talking like very low dose here. And we had intermittent conversations, and he experienced periods of being freezing and feeling like his insides were burning. And significant memory recall of traumatic experiences occurred, followed by an organic reframing into self-accepting and compassionate insights. Significant contractions in the right shoulder were released through gentle pressure touch, and this felt like a residual birth trauma. At one point I actually had his hands in mine, and he was pulling himself, like metaphorically, out of a birth canal. At one point he started to roar, which then turned into the sound of an infant crying, taking his first breath, and at which point he started exclaiming, "I'm reborn, I'm reborn." The second day was more psychedelic in nature, more like a psilocybin experience than MDMA. He had acute inner visuals. It was no longer just memory recall, but memory visualization with strong transpersonal, mystical, and historic context. At one point he stated, "This is soul medicine. Cannabis is healing my soul, bringing my soul back together. Cannabis is healing my soul." And this began a many-minute monologue of first speaking in a young child's voice about being held down and forced to take ADHD medication when he was a child and the abuse he faced in his family system. After which his voice changed to an empowered adult, and after speaking encouragingly to his younger part of himself, he reclaimed the meaning of his name, which means lion's strength. At this point, he began to roar. And I'd like to speak to this last part gently, and maybe emotionally triggering for some of us. After a few moments of rest, he started screaming, quote, "I'm being put in an oven. I'm being put in an oven. I don't want to die. I'm being put in an oven. It hurts. It burns. I don't want to die. It burns. My whole body is burning." At this point, I had a significant choice point as a facilitator, and he was clearly referring to Nazi concentration camps. This image wasn't just any image, and I've heard a lot of things before. It was definitely one that took me to my core. Do I pull him out of the experience? He was in distress, but he wasn't out of control. He was remaining within a witness space as he was allowing himself to fully experience it. I saw the lineage of his family and the fear that he held. I could see the oven and the injuries in his family system that caused his trauma. And it's just a feeling of deep horror that people have experienced this before. And trusting the process and accepting the psychedelic theory that a symptom is something halfway out, and that this is what healing looks like. I sat behind him, put my hand on his arm, gently said, "You're not alone in this. I'm right here with you. This is yours to do. This is yours to face. You can trust this process." He immediately started screaming again, but he didn't resist it. "It burns, it burns. It hurts so bad it burns. I don't want to die. I don't want to hurt. I want to live. It burns, it burns. I want to live, I want to live. The Americans are coming, the Americans are coming. I'm safe, I'm safe. Victory, victory. I'm not a Holocaust survivor, I'm a Holocaust thriver. And that was 6 minutes of a very full experience. On my end, I oscillated between deep and profound gratitude for witnessing such a healing experience and a deep and profound horror and grief of experiencing firsthand through my imagination and his body felt sense one of the darkest periods in our collective history. One of the worst things that one human being could do to another. I saw my grandfather, quote, the Americans flying in the bombers. I saw millions of people fleeing in horror, There are very few words that can describe how I was feeling in that moment and took me to my core as a therapist. What if this is victory? I let myself breathe into that and feel it fully in my own body. What if this is what real victory looks like? What if this is what trauma healing looks like? And we spent the remainder of the session brainstorming about future possibilities, going back to school, starting a business, getting new friends and a girlfriend, and just generally basking in the presence of a deeply healing divine light. This is what happened last week in my practice. And like many psychedelic therapists, this happens regularly in our practices. The post-session results, the young man's presence was dramatically different the next day. He had color in his face and he was standing up straight. He kept asking me, so is this strength I feel in my back, is it going to stay? He had hope again. Does trauma resolution hold the key to positive social change? And do psychedelics hold the key to trauma resolution? I like to ask impossible questions because I know that psychedelics have an incredible track record for uncovering impossible solutions. A big question I wonder about is how do we make war obsolete? How do we survive the current climate crisis? And I thought that was one of those unsolvable questions. I really did. And I realized in this session, witnessing what he went through, was that the answer is in trauma healing, the answer is in trauma resolution, and the answer is preventing trauma. We can do this on a large scale with these medicines. We already have the tools to do it. So what is yours to do in the world? And what is mine? I'm doing this psychedelic cannabis thing, and we're gonna be building structures to have large-scale psychedelic therapy cannabis experiences. And we're developing a protocol for an 8-person cannabis experience with a couple of facilitators. And then this book this conference inspired me to write a book, and it's going to be published next month. It's called Psychedelic Cannabis, Breaking the Gate. And I'd like to invite anybody who's interested in this work to come visit me in Colorado, and then also I'd like to invite any researchers to come help us explore this medicine further. I think it's warranted to be the 4th medicine that we've been speaking to today. And thank you very much.